Thank you, Marcia, and thank you for asking me to share some meditations today. That poem by Thich Nhat Hanh is one that has been with me and troubled me for years. And when you invited me to speak today, it felt like being called to really grapple with it at another level. I am the 12-year-old girl, refugee on a small boat who throws herself into the ocean after being raped by a sea pirate. And I am the pirate, my heart not yet capable of seeing and loving. Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh did not come by those words lightly. His writing of them was not an act of spiritual bypass. He lived through wars, was exiled from his home country for over 40 years because he would not take sides in the Civil War, was censored as too radical by the Buddhist establishment for promoting gender equality and the notion that monks should be actively involved in assisting those suffering and in the political issues of their day. He directly helped to rescue over 800 so-called boat people and convinced several countries to take in more Vietnamese refugees than they'd been accepting. In 1967, Martin Luther King Jr., certainly not one to go in for spiritual bypassing, nominated him for a Nobel Peace Prize. Here's how Thich Nhat Hanh tells the story of what led to writing that poem, Please Call Me by My True Names. One day we received a letter telling us about a young girl on a small boat who was raped by a pirate. She was only 12 and she jumped into the ocean and drowned herself. When you first learn of something like that, you get angry at the pirate. You naturally take the side of the girl. As you look more deeply, you will see it differently. If you take the side of the little girl, then it's easy. You only have to take a gun and shoot the pirate. But we can't do that. In my meditation, I saw that if I had been born in the village of the pirate and raised in the same conditions as he was, I would now be the pirate. I can't condemn myself so easily. In my meditation, I saw that many babies are born along the Gulf of Siam, hundreds every day, and if we educators, social workers, politicians, and others do not do something about the situation, in 25 years, a number of them will become pirates. If you or I were born today in those fishing villages, we might become pirates in 25 years. If you take a gun and shoot the pirate, you shoot all of us, because all of us are to some extent responsible for this state of affairs. After a long meditation, I wrote this poem. In it, there are three people, the 12-year-old girl, the pirate, and me. Can we look at each other and recognize ourselves in each other? The title of the poem is Please Call Me by My True Names, because I have so many names. When I hear any one of these names, I have to say, yes. I shared a bit about Thich Nhat Hanh's history with you because I want to distinguish the teaching being offered by him from what I perceive as harmful words that I often hear some white people voicing after a Black person has been killed by the police. Words that are encouraging us all to avoid dehumanizing the cop in question and to have compassion for him. There are a few differences between those kinds of comments in Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching that I believe are important. In Buddhism, one of the aspects of the Eightfold Path that is offered as the way to end suffering is wise speech. And wise speech is speech that is not only truthful, but also useful and timely. And it's certainly not useful or timely to be telling people who are angry and grieving to extend compassion to a murderer who's protected by a racist institution of sanctioned violence. There's also pieces that tend to be missing from those comments. As Thich Nhat Hanh points out, we all need to do something about the situation. We're all to some extent responsible for the state of affairs. He's dedicated his life to transforming the conditions that lead to violence, including at great risk and cost to his own life, and that fact influences how his invitation to find compassion for the perpetrators of harm lands for me. And then there's the issue of what assumptions we make about the meaning of extending compassion. Another problem with many of those comments in the wake of a police shooting is that they often seem to be asking us to all just be nice, to tuck in our anger, to engage in spiritual bypass, rather than taking responsibility for doing the extremely difficult work that accessing the kind of revolutionary compassion Thich Nhat Hanh describes would require of us, to recognize ourselves in everyone involved in the situation and dedicate ourselves to helping alleviate and prevent those kinds of suffering, which in my assessment, when it comes to the cop, means helping him to leave that system of destruction and join the work to abolish it and to make as many amends as he can for the harm he caused. I'm starting by reflecting on these distinctions because the thing that planted itself in my heart to talk about when I was invited to give a testimony today is a question that feels complicated to lean into as a white person in this moment. The question of, what if there is no judgment day? I hope what I share will feel useful and not cause harm. I invite you to provide me with feedback on both fronts, and if I do cause harm, I will listen carefully and attempt to make amends. What if there is no judgment day? Another way of asking this question continues the theme that Nicola preached on last month, or at least the way I interpreted her sermon. What if there is always a blessing available to us? She spoke about Jacob stealing his brother's blessing from their father, but still being blessed by God, and proposed that God's blessing is available to us whether we deserve it or not, and even whether we end up changing as a result of that blessing or not. She pointed out that Jacob was able to receive the blessing when he got honest with himself and with God. What if the blessing is still there for us, even if we aren't able to receive it? If we can't get honest, or if we think we are being honest, but still have perspectives on reality that cause lots of suffering? I should probably take a step back and talk about how I'm understanding this notion of blessing. The way I interpret it, the blessing is a declaration, a promise of belonging that becomes a visceral experience if we dare to surrender to it, which can feel like a risk because what if it's not real? What if we surrender and show our full selves and then get rejected after all? And so we prophylactically reject the blessing, which we might also call the love, to avoid feeling that fear of rejection or of not fully belonging. But what if the blessing is still there for us even if we reject it? What if the blessing persists until we can trust it and let it in to do its transformative work? And in the meantime, what if there is no judgment day? Just endless opportunities to try again, whether in this lifetime, or through being reborn, or through those who persist after us, or through the spirit realm. Another way of asking the question, what if there is no heaven and hell? I've heard some people redefine the notion of hell from a torture chamber of fire and brimstone to instead define it as the absence of God. But what if there is no such thing as the absence of God? The Nigerian philosopher Bayo Komolafe is constantly reminding us that humans are not the only beings with agency and that we are in far less control of things than we often believe ourselves to be. In a recent interview, he contemplated our notions of righteousness and used, quote, "The language of waking up can be useful, but it suggests you're in or out, good or bad, racist or anti-racist. It doesn't allow for understanding that we are conditioned by agonistic forces that are beyond our ability to control. Maybe we should curb our expectations of full arrival. Maybe we can only embrace approach." What if there is no judgment day, just the endless invitation to approach ways of living that may never be perfect, but are more humble, to practice shifting away from internalized notions of supremacy, whether that's white supremacy, male supremacy, Christian supremacy, US supremacy, human supremacy, or any assumed supremacy of being or knowing. Last week, Liza proposed the idea that God doesn't know it all either, specifically that they don't know the future but are with us in the uncertainty. What if God is also with us in the imperfection? What if letting go of the notion of perfection itself in relationship to anything, including God, can help us release our aspirations to perfection? And perhaps this could help us shift from regimes and cycles of judgment and punishment as the primary ways we deal with each other. I want to pause and share that I believe there's different medicine needed for different people at different times. And my orientation to religion, faith, and spirituality has always been that I'm less interested in what's true and more interested in what's useful. And what's useful shifts according to the circumstances. Sometimes I've found it life-saving to turn to a God who I perceive as a perfect, benevolent, powerful caregiver who's got my back and can embrace and hold me through hard times. The God who's a reliable friend or can parent me when I need some extra parenting. I've also sometimes found the notion of an omnipotent, judgmental God useful as a motivating force. A God who knows when I'm not acting in alignment with my values and pressures me to do better or risk not faring well on Judgment Day. But there can also be a real shadow side to having a specific image of God and believing in the perfection and righteousness of that. White supremacy grows out of Christian supremacy, and the notion some people had of being made in the image of God and that there's only one true God and that it was doing God's work to destroy or oppress anyone who doesn't believe in him or resemble him and to control all other forms of life on the planet. My point is that what's at stake for me regarding how we perceive of God is what that perception, that belief motivates in us. How does it move us, influence us? What are the consequences of those beliefs? And they're not necessarily the same for each person, although there might be some cultural tendencies worth exploring, certain things that are more likely to be opened up or closed off by certain conceptions. And I have an intuition that this current moment might be well served by a concept of God as non-judgmental, less concerned with what's right and wrong, good and evil, and more concerned with offering opportunities to experience ourselves as part of the infinite fabric of beings, not at the center of it all, but just a piece of things so vast it's absurd to think we could understand them, let alone control them, but to experience ourselves as belonging to them. This is not to relinquish a sense of responsibility or to give up on accountability and doing our parts to alleviate suffering, but to release the anxiety of perfection and never being able to do enough or be enough or get it right. There's a teaching in Buddhism on the 8 worldly concerns of ego that can be summed up as praise and blame, fame and shame, loss and gain, pleasure and pain, all the same. Those first 4, praise, blame, fame, and shame, are all wrapped up in image management. And if we're motivated by these things, it can be incredibly anxiety-producing, especially because they need to be constantly recreated. And it's so hard not to get stuck on these things. Even working on this testimony, I had this voice in the back of my head hoping that you all would love it and find it brilliant, and scared that you would hate it and find it harmful. In other words, seeking your praise and the fame, excuse me, seeking your praise and the fame that would come from that, and being afraid of your blame and the shame that would come from that. And in a punitive society where what follows judgment is punishment, whether in the form of corporal punishment, imprisonment, or being shunned and losing relationships, the stakes of messing up are high. Whereas if I can let go of all that, I have way more emotional and spiritual capacity to hear to whom my words and actions were useful and why, and to whom they were harmful and why, and to shift and adjust, not to better manage my image and avoid punishment, but precisely to be more responsible and accountable in an ever-shifting landscape for which I know all of us are co-responsible. And by all of us, I don't just mean humans, but all beings. It takes the pressure off in a way that I imagine could be very generative. And at the very least, it might get rid of that annoying thing those of us who are progressive white folks can do of trying to prove to ourselves and people of color that we are good white people, different from those others. Of course, for some folks, this release of judgment might not be the right medicine, or at least not in every moment. It might just lead to hedonism, narcissism, nihilism, or indifference. But for those of us inspired by the vision of abolition, I wonder whether maybe letting go of judgment would help us move closer to that. When we talk about abolishing the police and prisons, we're talking about abolishing some of the primary arms of white supremacy. But I worry those will likely just be replaced with new arms, just like the arms of slavery and Jim Crow were, if we understand abolition as erasure by conquest, vanquishing an enemy, rather than as a deeper kind of transformation and ongoing practice that never has an end point. A lot of abolitionists talk about the process of abolition being making those oppressive punitive institutions obsolete by building other things that become more compelling and relevant, like transformative justice. And in transformative justice, there's support given to the perpetrators as well as to the people who have been harmed, because the assumption is that we all need to heal if we're going to do things drastically differently than we've been doing them. There's that saying, hurt people, and I wonder if we might also say punished people punish people. What if the alternative to punishment, which is an attempt to cast people out, is relationship, an attempt to invite people in? It seems this is what folks pursuing transformative justice are doing, not isolating anyone, not casting anyone out. Which does not always mean those who have been harmed need to work directly with their abusers when this can cause even further harm. In the case of white supremacy, for example, it can be helpful to have groups of white people working with each other on divesting from whiteness. Supporting each other in this way itself feels like part of the process of undoing some of our white racial conditioning, as I feel that perhaps one of our deepest underlying issues as white people has to do with self-imposed isolation. The isolation of hyper-individualism, accompanied by myths of self-sufficiency and the self-made man, ignoring how much of what we've accumulated was actually stolen by exploiting others' labor through slavery and capitalism. The isolation of having given up our cultures to become white. The isolation from having committed genocide to claim the land we've settled on and having treated that land as an object to control. All of these things are acts of severing relationship. It's unsurprising, given all this, that many of us do not have a satisfying sense of belonging anywhere. And I'd argue that the right-wing version of this reveals itself in the very anxious posturing and heavily armored defending of an imagined white, straight Christian America as a grasping for a place of belonging. And I think mixed in with both the left-wing and right-wing anxieties is the fear, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious, that no one would ever want to share a place of belonging with us because we've been so fucked up for so long and clearly don't understand what it means to share. Perhaps what abolition means for white people is a process of remembering ourselves as part of the vast kinship of beings. And what if engaging this process and having experiences of belonging is far more effective than any amount of punishment could ever be in inspiring the kind of deep transformation that leads to committed action to make amends, reparations, and devote ourselves to humbly participating in the interdependent web of life? This is not about letting white people or any other people who have caused harm off the hook, but about questioning what kinds of hooks might actually shift some outcomes. Not that these can ever be predicted or guaranteed, but it does seem like punitive approaches have not gotten us where we want to go. Maybe the blessing approach is what's needed to open up more spaces in which change can happen. And I'm not suggesting that any of us start trying to practice these things with those who have caused the largest amounts of harm to us or others. I think the Buddhist practice of loving kindness meditation can be instructive here. The teaching around that is to cultivate the muscle of loving kindness by starting with those for whom it's easiest to generate that feeling, which might actually not even be human beings, but a pet or a favorite tree. Starting with an abusive partner or Trump or cops or vigilantes who've killed people would be going through superficial motions, would be spiritual bypass. And because when we're talking about transformative justice, we're not just talking about cultivating attitudes and feelings, but about new forms of accountability, there also need to be containers and communities in place that can hold everyone involved for what can be years-long processes. I know for myself, it can be a real struggle to be able to practice these things even towards myself or with people I love and generally feel good about when I or they have said or done something that hurts or upsets me. But at least in those situations, I can access the emotional desire to get to the place of addressing things in compassionate, non-punitive ways. So those are the places that feel fruitful to practice and to notice what happens when we engage ourselves and each other like this. Whereas when it comes to larger harms, my emotions and my spirit are honestly in different places around all this. And I believe we also need to honor our emotions. The point is not to suppress our anger or hurt or demands, even if the mechanisms that exist for accountability right now are not of our ideal design, are not transformative justice. For example, I feel a ton of resistance to offering up compassion for perpetrators when we're talking about a context in which white people who murder Black people are taken to Burger King or offered water and allowed to just walk away and have their jobs and freedom protected by police unions, whereas so many Black people who are not hurting anyone are criminalized, targeted, incarcerated, and killed. Engaging those perpetrators with compassion is not what I want to make a priority. It feels like coddling those who are already incredibly coddled, adding insult to injury. Emotionally, when it comes to those kinds of situations, I can sometimes feel like Judgment Day is the only recourse for justice. It's hard for me to imagine accountability that doesn't involve punishment, because that feels like literally letting them get away with murder, and that doesn't feel okay. But I can't deny that spiritually, I feel called to learn how to approach practicing accountability and justice without making anyone the enemy to be punished, vanquished, or exiled. To move away from a story of an epic battle of good against evil. To quote Bayo Akamalafe again, quote, as one who grew up in the calcified ruins of my people's victory over their once masters, he's talking about Nigeria in this context. He says, my bones are marked by a strange and ironic wisdom. That victory is very often a bigger risk than failure. That salvation binds us to an ontology that cannot account for our entanglements with those we want to defeat. When I stick to the abstract principles, I can talk passionately about these ideals, about composting and compassion and transformation. But when it comes to moving out of the abstract and grappling with concrete situations under current circumstances, I don't actually know how to practice this in ways that don't feel like adding on to the injustice and or spiritual bypass. I need God for this. And conceiving of God, not even as an independent entity that bestows blessings, but God as the blessings themselves that are always available to us no matter what, feels like a key that might unlock some different ways of doing things, some different ways of being, ways that are currently beyond my wildest imaginations. What if there is no judgment day, not because we can't determine the difference between things that are beneficial and things that cause harm, but because no one, including God, can be an ultimate judge, because no one, including God, stands outside of anything. We all, including this force we call God, and innumerable other beings, human and otherwise, are in this together, constantly co-creating each infinitely complex moment, co-responsible for it all. What if there is no judgment day, but only infinite opportunities to heal and to deepen into relationship? And what if those opportunities are infinite because there is no final point of being healed, of having reached a point of completing the process? What if the impossibility of achieving perfection is precisely necessary to keep us humble, whereas the illusion of the possibility of perfection, and anyone being able to define that, actually contributes to the harms of supremacist and separatist thinking and acting? What if we lean into Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching that everything is simply the outgrowth of the infinite causes and conditions that have come before, that we would probably act the same way as any perpetrator if we'd lived their same life? What might happen if all the energy, time, and resources we spend on judging and punishing ourselves and each other were freed up for doing the work of creating different conditions? Excuse me. What might happen if all the energy, time, and resources we spend on judging and punishing ourselves and each other were freed up for doing the work of creating different conditions that cause less harm? What if there is no judgment day? I want to just share briefly too that I had asked Ashley if we could play the song "In Comes the Rain" as the song after the testimony, because I love how you can hear it both as humans calling forth the rain as a rain song, since we certainly need that right now, and because you can also hear it as the rain calling on us to change our rhythms, our habitual ways of being, by coming down off our perches of supremacy, including human supremacy, down into the depths that maybe we need to sink into, where we can grieve and let our tears flow and flow like rain, and join in the process of making the world anew.
Amen.
Amen.
Wow.
Amen.
Yes.
Oh my
Amen.
God.
Dang.
That was definitely
You
more
prepared a lot for this whole